Good morning, folks. Sorry we're a couple minutes late. I'm Stephanie Noren, the Communications Manager for Washington for Climate Solutions. Welcome to another edition of Climate Leaders Live. We're super excited to be hosting a number of speakers to look back at the 2021 Washington legislative session that happened all digitally, no in-person meetings due to COVID. And so we're going to talk a lot about a number of the significant policy wins this session. And we're going to give folks a couple minutes to join, so we'll get started here shortly. All right, looks like we have some continuing to have folks trickle in and join. We'll give folks a few, maybe 2 more minutes, and we'll get started here at 10:06. So sit tight. Alrighty, well, thank you for joining us this morning for a look back at the 2021 Washington legislative session. I am Stephanie Noren, the Communications Manager of the State of Washington for Climate Solutions. We've got a host of Climate Solutions people on today, and I'll run through them very quickly, as well as provide intros to other folks. So we have Leah Missick with Climate Solutions, Kelly Hall, Vlad Goodman-Britton, and Deepa Sabirjan. We also have Paula Sardinas with Washington Build Back Black Alliance, and David Mendoza with the Nature Conservancy. And without further ado, just a quick note, if you've got questions, go ahead and post them in the Q&A, and we will also monitor the chat for questions. And we are providing closed captioning today. You can turn on the live transcript by selecting that button in the Zoom toolbar if you'd rather read along, which is super helpful for me sometimes. And without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And Vlad, I think you're kicking us off.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephanie, for helping put this together. Really happy to be here with this group of folks and parts of the coalition that really moved some major climate policy across the finish line, but certainly not the entirety of it. I'll start at sort of a little bit of a high level. We'll go through some policies. Love to take questions and answer them from you all toward the end. So just to kind of start at a high level, I just wanted to, it's sort of really important to note how significant 2021 was. 2021, the legislative session 2021 was a historically low production year for our legislature because it was all virtual. We'll pass fewer bills in this long session than at any time really in the last 40 years or something like that. And fewer even than some short sessions, but the bills that did pass were just enormously consequential, not just in the environment and climate space, but far beyond that in advancing a more progressive tax system, in racial equity and policing justice, and other things that I think maybe we'll touch on briefly here over the course of the next hour or so. On the climate front, as well as on those other fronts, it was the culmination of years and years and years of effort by some of the groups on the call, as well as many others. People who contributed to past efforts. The first cap and invest bill that was introduced in Washington was back in 2009. People really put their heart and soul into these bills. Not all of them are still at our organizations, but they were essential in building the education and the constituency and the organizing and the activist core that really made possible the wins this year. And so that their names are on all of these as well. And then just really important to emphasize that none of these policies that we're going to discuss would be possible without the major, substantial intersectional coalitions that push for them. Some time ago, it's been some years, but unfortunately not enough years since the environmental community recognized that first of all, we can't pass environmental policy by ourselves, nor should we really. And so the coalitions that got these policies across the finish line included, of course, Climate Solutions, the Nature Conservancy, and Build Back Black Lions, who are on the call, but many other groups that aren't, including tribal nations are an essential part of the effort to improve and activate these bills. Businesses from different places, the clean energy businesses, and just businesses focused on their role in decarbonizing our economy. Black Lives Matter, and many, many other groups that were, key for getting us where we are today. So on the next slide, I'll just sort of summarize the four kind of policy areas we're going to kind of go through. One is on transportation, the passage of the Clean Fuel Standard, focus on decarbonizing our largest source of emission in transportation. Two is a number of small but really meaningful steps forward on building electrification. Building emissions are growing at a faster rate than any other sector of our economy, even more so than transportation. And we've moved the ball forward on that, but much more to come in coming years. Washington is the second state to adopt a economy-wide price on carbon, and ours is by far the strongest one in the country and among the strongest in the world in terms of capping and reducing carbon, directing us toward a net zero economy. And the HEAL Act really incorporates environmental justice into the core of everything that state government does. So we'll go through those. I'm going to pass it to Leah, Climate Solutions Washington Transportation Policy Manager, to talk about the Clean Fuel Standard first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vlad. Really excited to talk to you all today about the Clean Fuel Standard. I don't know if it's scrambling for other folks or if it's just me on the visual here. But just to there we go. Cool. Just to get started, the Clean Fuel Standard, like Vlad mentioned, is one of these policies that we have been working on for quite a long time. And when I say we, again, this is a broader coalition of folks who are in other organizations and also folks who have sort of come and gone from working on this policy, but this win really belongs to all of us. And this was the fourth session in a row attempting to pass the Clean Fuel Standard, but work had been going on years prior to that. So we are really excited that this has finally gotten across the finish line. I'll outline quickly, high level, how the policy works, and then I'll talk about the benefits of it and what we might see in our local communities as a result of the Clean Fuel Standard. Again, just to emphasize the coalition behind the Clean Fuel Standard, because I'm really proud the coalition grew every single year. It was not just environmental groups. We had labor unions in support. We had local governments, tribal government, different businesses, local restaurants in support, the health community, faith community leaders, Washington Build Back Black, of course, and NRDC, who are on this call, our Nature Conservancy, NRDC, a lot of the larger traditional enviro groups, and yeah, our partners on this call who all were coalesced around getting this policy through because of the climate wins, but also the health and addressing air pollution inequities that this policy will help us do. So if you could go back, please, on the slide. So basically what this policy does is it requires a reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. It will require a 20% reduction by 2038. And when I say fuels, I don't just mean liquid fuels. I don't just mean, gas, diesel, biofuels. I'm also talking about electricity being used as a transportation fuel. And that's really important because thanks to the hard work of a lot of different organizations, in 2019, we passed the 100% clean electricity law, which means that our grid will be 100% fossil free by 2045. And this is going to be really critical as we electrify our transportation system. We're going to be running it off of truly clean energy. And when we're talking about the carbon intensity of the fuels as a part of this law, we're looking at the life cycle analysis. So we're truly looking at clean fuels when we're talking about the clean fuel standard. And so if you're a dirty fuels producer, if you're producing a fuel that's above that carbon intensity, you either have to clean up your act or you have to directly purchase credits from your competitors, clean fuels producers, in order to comply. So it creates a positive reinvestment cycle for clean fuels because clean fuels producers like electric utilities, biofuels producers, those who operate public charging stations and more will be able to receive additional money that accounts for the fact that they are producing and providing cleaner fuels and create this positive investment cycle for those businesses and organizations and entities. Next slide. So what are we going to get sort of high level? Of course, with the Clean Fuel Standard, we will see tremendous climate progress. It's really important that we have a direct policy that looks at the transportation sector because this is our top polluting sector in Washington state with close to half of our climate pollution coming from this sector. But in addition to cutting down on greenhouse gas pollution, we're also going to be cutting down on air pollution criteria pollutants, for example, particulate matter, that come from using fossil fuels in our transportation system. And I want to note that there are real racial inequities here in who suffers the most from this transportation pollution. Due to racist practices like redlining and building highways for communities of color, through communities of color, for example, we see a disparity in who is being more burdened by this transportation pollution, who lives near transportation and freight corridors. And so as we cut down the fossil fuel use in our transportation sector, we're going to be reducing these health harming pollutants as well. And then finally, we're really excited for the economic benefits, both on a more macro level. We're really excited for the creation of green jobs. For example, installing public charging infrastructure. Those jobs can't be exported. And we'll also be keeping clean fuels here at home and our dollars here at home. Right now, we send about $9 billion each year out of state to purchase gas and diesel. We can purchase locally produced clean fuels, including electricity. So I'm really excited about that. And then we'll just be providing lower cost transportation choices and transportation fuel choices as well. This policy, and I'll get to this in a minute, will help transit agencies, but it also will expand access to using electricity as a fuel, which is about a third as expensive as gas. And on the freight side, in California, thanks to their standard, renewable biodiesel is cheaper than conventional fossil diesel, thanks to the Clean Fuel Standard. So again, broadening access to fuels that are actually cheaper. Next slide. And so what does this, just digging a little deeper, what does this mean for local communities? As I mentioned, utilities will be significant credit generators thanks to them producing electricity as a clean fuel. And they will be required to reinvest this money into expanding access to clean transportation. So out of the money that utilities will be generating, half of that has to be directed toward transportation electrification projects. And of that amount, 60% has to directly benefit areas that are overburdened by air pollution. This is really important. And I'm really excited about what we can see these investments go toward. We can sort of get a feel for what might happen here when we look at what's happening in Oregon. You have utilities that are basically providing school districts with electric school buses at no additional cost compared to conventional diesel buses. So this will help, our kids breathe cleaner air and help school districts not have to spend as much money on transportation. In Oregon, we actually have seen an electric tractor go into go into use that different folks can borrow and use. We see the build out of the public charging network. We see nonprofits receive electric vehicles at no additional cost. So we're really excited about these investments. Also, as I mentioned earlier, fleet operators, including transit agencies that operate electric vehicles, will be generating credits for their deployed vehicles. In California, thanks to their standard, transit agencies are getting about $10,000 per year per bus, thanks to their clean fuel standard. So this really creates a positive reinforcement for transit agencies and other operators that are using electric vehicles, and will help them accelerate their commitment to cleaning up our transportation system. Similarly, public charging operators will generate credits, and that helps with their business model and helps them expand. So we all have access to public charging and reduced cost electric vehicles. So we're really excited about how this will benefit us, not only in terms of our sort of personal transportation, but it'll help our public transportation system. It'll help clean up our different fleets. It'll help clean up freight. It'll result in air pollution reduction. So we're just really excited about seeing this policy roll out in Washington. And with that, I will turn it back over to Vlad.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'm going to talk about the Climate Commitment Act, and we'll actually tag team this with a few folks. But as I mentioned, the Climate Commitment Act is a cap and invest system. Washington is the second state in the country to adopt an economy-wide system like this. This is also probably by far the most ambitious and effective such policy adopted anywhere in the world, including the European Union, certainly California and other WCI jurisdictions. It's been a long road to get to where we are today. As I think I mentioned earlier, the first such cap and invest bill was introduced in 2009. It actually passed both chambers, but in different forms, and the legislature couldn't get on the same page about it. And we've sort of been in the desert ever since then. Multiple pieces of carbon pricing legislation, including a cap and invest proposal in 2015, and multiple initiatives. And ultimately, we land here with the Climate Commitment Act, which again is probably the strongest of all the ones proposed and debated in this state for the last 12 years. So the Climate Commitment Act, the core of the Climate Commitment Act is a firm and declining cap on greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Washington. So it requires a 45% reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2030, where our emissions are above where they were in 1990. So this is about a 50+ % reduction by 2030 compared to today, which means that Washington would be doing its part consistent with the IPCC reports and other reports that chart a path to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So really, really aggressive and ambitious policy, and that 2030 target is on track for a net zero 95% reduction by 2050. The policy does provide limited access to offsets, but unlike other cap and invest policies, for the first time, the offsets are under the cap. In California, one of the kind of defects of their policy is that offsets are being used as a way to increase emissions above the cap, and especially with the low integrity of some of the offsets that has been documented recently. This fundamentally means that these offsets are causing an increase in pollution compared to the actual targets and science-based limits that exist in those places. In Washington, we're just not going to allow that here. We will constrain the allowance supply so that the allowances plus offsets equals our cap, and so fundamentally we're protecting at all times the integrity of the cap that we're imposing here. So this is a substantial innovation compared to other places that have this policy, and I think it goes to kind of one of the core watchwords for all of us in this work, which was learn from and improve on other places. California went first, and with that goes some mistakes. And while certainly we always want Washington to be a leader and pioneer, if we're going to go second, the reason to go second is to do better, is to make a policy an improvement on what's come before, both in terms of the integrity of the cap mechanism, the carbon reductions, as well as some of the other things that we're going to discuss. One of those things I'm going to pass to David now is these really path-breaking air quality regulations that are included in this policy alongside the carbon cap itself.
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. Yeah, I think these air quality policies were critical to the broad support that this legislation got from legislators and community members as this bill was developed. And so it's a parallel program, essentially, and it starts with the installation of air monitoring networks, enhancing and improving the air monitoring networks that we have in Washington State, but especially focused in overburdened communities. that this has to be done, as soon as possible, no later than 2023, in order to provide the data that would then trigger the Department of Ecology's authority to establish air quality targets. And these targets can be based on, or could be based on two things. One, the natural ambient air quality standards established by EPA, or air quality experienced in neighboring communities that are not identified as overburdened communities, meaning bringing the overburdened communities to the same level as non-burdened communities. And so the choice there is to whatever is more protective of human health. And so that's the direction that ecology has. And so it's critical to get this network up and running so they understand the baseline of where these communities are, what the sources of pollution are, what types of pollution are the most problematic, and then they can trigger their authority to move forward. And then in 2023 and every 2 years thereafter, throughout the life of this program, the Department of Ecology is directed to conduct environmental justice reviews to understand, are emissions going down, what kind of emissions are going down, and then they are authorized to make adjustments to both the air quality program and the cap and trade side of the program to adjust the nodules that might not be maximizing the benefits of these of reductions. And so that is another lesson learned from California, is that this is one of the largest critiques of the lack of reduction of health harming criteria pollutants in overburdened communities. And this was our collective policy response of how to adjust for that to ensure that we get these reductions in communities. So we're servicing kind of our global commitment of reducing our greenhouse gas, but actually ensuring that we're serving our communities as well by reducing these health harming pollutants. And then one last thing, the overall thing that's important to talk about here is the Environmental Justice Council set up in the HEAL Act, which I'll describe in a little bit, is kind of helping oversee all this process, advising ecology throughout the rulemaking process, throughout implementation, on the technical aspects of allowances, offsets, rules, and then also on the distribution process. How are the agencies going to distribute these significant funds, which we'll talk about, but this EJ Council is critical to ensuring the effectiveness of this program.
Thanks so much, David. And yeah, so the funds is the investment vehicle that this policy creates is one of its most powerful, alongside the two regulatory mechanisms we just described, is kind of the third leg of the stool in the effectiveness and opportunities this policy represents. So the state of Washington, the state produced a fiscal note that estimated a little over $8 billion generated by this policy between its initiation in 2023 and 2037, and it would continue producing revenue for investment after that. That's a conservative figure. The actual number will depend on what allowances auction for and trade at and things like that. But we can conservatively count on that $8 billion being available to Washington to invest. And like I said, there's a lot of good reason to believe it'll be higher. And so where will that money go? So first of all, $5 billion will be dedicated to transportation carbon reduction. And that's a range of investments, including investments in mass transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, and transportation electrification. This is a major step forward, a historic investment on the part of Washington, the greatest such investment that our state has committed to this category of investment in its history. The last time the state adopted the transportation package, the equivalent number was $1 billion. So this is a substantial increase in really expanding transportation and transit equity and access, as well as reducing our reliance on oil. The balance of the money is going to go to a range of additional investments, about $3 billion, and again, potentially much more, will go to investments in carbon reductions in other sectors. So, for example, building electrification and industrial efficiency, and natural resources that could include a variety of investments to really deal with the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing, the massive and substantially increased forest fires and flooding risks and things like that we've seen, that we know are at sea level rise, that are a direct result of our changing climate, and we finally have a dedicated investment vehicle to start adapting and preparing ourselves for the impacts of climate change that we've already seen. And so this $8 billion together is that kind of third leg of the stool. In addition to the cap on the regulatory cap on carbon emissions, in addition to the regulatory cap on other criteria pollutants that David described, there's going to be a critical mass here dedicated to investments that also achieve those same goals: carbon reduction and air quality improvements through investments in communities. I want to pass it back to David to talk a bit about some of the environmental justice pieces of the investment scheme as well.
Yeah, I think a critical aspect, and you can see by the amount of money that's going, there's a direct direction in the bill that says 35% of all revenue must be invested in overburdened communities. And you can see the definition of overburdened communities on your screen. So this will help ensure that those who've been most impacted by pollution in the past are starting to see the benefits of these investments moving forward. Other dedicated investments in this legislation include 10% of all these funds also have to be invested on tribal lands. And then there's, as Rab described, some of the big buckets. There's some specific callouts of dedicated funding, specific dollar amounts over, from this amount of money. Top of that list, I would say, is $50 million for tribal mitigation adaptation. Many tribal nations, especially coastal nations, are facing really negative impacts of climate change, including rising sea level, needing to relocate traditional villages in order to adjust for that. So there is a dedicated $50 million every biennium for the life of this program to invest in helping those tribal nations adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Also, the air quality program I talked about is going to be regularly funded with $20 million of investments for a range of investments for community as well as implementation every biennium as well. A couple other smaller investments include $5 million for a tribal offset project development. The offset programs, as described, the tribal governments will be able to access this $5 million every biennium to help develop projects that can be implemented on their traditional territories. And then $10 million of forest and agricultural riparian investments so that these properties, forest and agricultural riparian, can help preserve the ecological, help capture carbon, and actually improve those ecological resources. Yeah, and that's how these investments will be focused on improving conditions for overburdened communities and just folks across the state.
Paula, you were just an essential part of the effort to get this across the finish line. Hope to bring you in to talk about the work you did and how it matched, and I guess the reasons why.
Thank you, Vlad, and thank you, David, so much. So good to be here. Paula Sardinas, founder, presidency of the Washington Build Back Black Alliance, and the climate justice or environmental justice piece just fit really well within our agenda. We've been doing this work for over 30 years, our firm has, in Washington and 7 other states. During the last legislative cycle for 2021, we put together what we felt like was a really good Black agenda for the Black and Brown community. And it centered around these 5 pillars of structural and systemic racism: economic development, digital equity, healthcare disparities, criminal justice reform, and food insecurity. So we looked at all of the environmental justice policies through the lens of healthcare disparities, because there's a correlation we saw with a lot of the good reporting that came out of the Environmental Justice Task Force between asthma, respiratory diseases, and the air that we breathe and intake. And so looking at all of the work that I think, as you guys have said, our organizations, Black Lives Matter, King County Equity, the good work that was done by groups like Front and Center, all of the work we've did over the past 30 years, it felt like this was a good time since the legislature had declared that they were going to pursue a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda to see if we could get groundbreaking policy here in Washington State. So some of the things that our firm took on, obviously the environmental justice package, which contained the HILL Act, Cap, Hill, and Invest, and a lot of the low carbon fuel standards bills, bills that we knew would just not only clean the air and give us a pathway to having, global climate policy, but also help to reduce some of the healthcare disparities that we've been battling for years within the Black and Brown community. We also worked on a package of 60 criminal justice bills, and we're fortunate to get 12 of those bills, about 20% across the finish line and signed into the law by governor. We saw a record number of investments, not just in this bill when you talk about the $8 billion, but more than almost $100 million are going to be invested in Black and Brown communities, and that's capital budget investments to make sure that we have infrastructure to build community within community. That's nearly $400 million that will be invested into rental and housing assistance. We saw, nearly $25 million being invested into food insecurity. We know that when you are hungry, you can't work and you can't learn. An unprecedented $329 million budget requested by OSPI, with the heartbeat of that being digital equity supporting Black, Brown, and overburdened communities. And so even though we passed a record low number of bills this legislative cycle because of COVID-19, right around 355, I believe it is, our firm had the pleasure on working on about 155 of those bills being signed into law. And so it was probably for us one of the most meaningful and impactful sessions. And as we explain this to advocates and activists in community, and they say, well, that's great. What does it mean for us? Well, when you look at bills like House Bill 1054, it will prevent things like chokeholds from law enforcement. It gives more accountability. When you look at bills like HB 1267, when someone is killed by law enforcement, we get to have independent investigations. And a couple of days, when you look at House Bill 1016 and the state of Washington, we've made Juneteenth a paid holiday. It won't be paid this year because of the things with COVID-19, but it will be paid next year for all state employees. We also went in and we added some additional protections and financial dollars for cannabis social equity. We know in the Black and Brown community, that's another issue that we have struggled with since I-502 became legal. And so when you think about what we're talking here about the Climate Commitment Act, when we talk about low carbon fuel standards, don't think about these policies as things that stand alone. Think about them as part of a greater, larger economic package that's going to really improve the life and the well-being of all people in overburdened communities. When we think about House Bill 1078, this is the automatic restoration of voter rights for felons. Representative Tara Simmons in her first session got that really great bill. When we think about things like Senate Bill 5405, that's requiring the legislature to do a joint audit to look at how equity is being applied, not just across the policies that we pass, but across state agencies. How are we going to look at ecology? How are we going to look at the Washington State LCB? How are we going to look at OFM and make sure that we've got the people in place who are now implementing these laws and they are looking at their agencies through the lens of equity? When we look at House Bill 1236 and Senate Bill 5126, this is tackling the heart of the rental crisis that we face here in Washington State. African Americans make up about 5% of the population. We make up about 78% of the rental market. So when we lift that eviction moratorium in a couple of weeks, we're talking about putting Black mothers and Black children out on the street. We tied all of these policies together and created one of the most progressive, forward-leaning racial equity policy sessions in the history. When you look at our little state in Washington and you look at some of the other states like California and New York, I would say to our activists and advocates listening is that we were far more progressive. We have 9 members in our Black member caucus. We have a very diverse member of color caucus, but it was combining both those members in the legislature with folks like Vlad and David and all of these organizations out doing the work that culminated in these wins that you guys can be proud of. And as you measure the impact of your real lives, you will see in the next coming week an increase in your unemployment benefits. You will see in the next coming weeks more legal protection so that you have the right to stay in your homes. 18 months from now, you'll have better air quality in your communities than what you have today. And so Vlad and David, I would just say that we've all worked together in a way that was collective. Black community, Asian Pacific community, Latinx community, our brothers and sisters in the Indigenous community. And this is the blueprint of how we go forward in future sessions and continue to get these really large, complicated, nuanced policies done. So it was just a pleasure to join with you guys and to do this work. As my friend David said, led by our only African-American Senator, Tawana Nobles, our People's Champion, Senator Saldana, Jamila Taylor, who is the chair of that Black Members Caucus. We really need to call out the folks who did that work and make sure that you know that these are not our wins, they're your wins. And we're looking forward to just doing more and hearing from you all in community.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paula. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've demonstrated that when we kind of work together across these lines, you know, these sort of artificial community lines, environmental community over here, equity community over there, you know, tribal nations over there, we don't get nearly as much done as when we work together, both in terms of changing the politics of the issue and also just making a better policy. You know, it's not, these policies are not just about carbon reduction, they're about public health, they're about equity and so much mobility and transit access and so much more. And that's because of the partnerships that we have built. So I want to jump ahead a couple of slides, talk about buildings, I think. Yeah. So we made some meaningful progress on buildings that I wanted to kind of underscore for folks today. As I mentioned, the building sector is growing. Building sector emissions are growing at a faster rate than any other sector, even faster than our largest sector, transportation. And when we make bad choices in the building sector, they're with us for a long time, right? You purchase a car, it's probably going to be replaced in 15 years. You make a bad choice in a building. You build a new building that is going to drive its emissions. It's going to be required to be heated with fossil fuels. That building is going to be with us for 60 years or more. Pipelines have a similar lifespan. So the choices, the consequences of bad emissions choices that we make in the building sector are with us for a very long time. So we're so happy that we sort of moved the ball forward in this space. There was $10 million dedicated by the state to building electrification, additional research money to commerce to more fully explore what electrification looks like for public utilities and other sectors of the economy. Washington becomes the 5th state, I believe, to order the initiation of a so-called future of gas docket. You know, really looking at what is the role of gas in our economy. The state energy strategy last year found that the most cost-effective way to decarbonize the sector is to stop burning stuff in our homes. Believe it or you know, perhaps not shocking to those on the phone. And the future of gas docket is really going to explore ways to decarbonize that sector, to decarbonize building heat and get the job done in terms of emission reductions in this space. We've also removed since 1988 our statutes in Washington have had a provision that said that it is the policy of the state of Washington to maintain and expand access to natural gas. So our state law for well over 30 years has said that the state policy is more and more fossil fuels for everybody, and we know that's the wrong direction to go. When we burn fossil fuels in our homes, we increase the risk of childhood asthma by 42%. An Australian study found that 1 on 10 childhood asthma cases are attributed to indoor natural gas use. A factor that burdens folks in apartments and much more than others who are less likely to have good ventilation and more likely to have older appliances. And apartment dwellers are statistically more likely to be lower income and people of color. So again, this is another source of pollution that disproportionately impacts our communities. And so it's essential to we're going to take this as an opportunity to chart a better path in this sector and really look at what local government can and must do to take advantage and build on the progress at the state level. Maybe Deepa can talk about that for a minute here.
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. I'm Deepa Sivarajan, and my focus at Climate Solutions is on those local level policies to promote clean, safe, and all electric buildings and to start that transition off of fossil gas. And as Vlad was mentioning, the investments and regulatory commitments made in the 2021 session really complement and support that local government work. This year, we've already seen several cities and counties in Washington take their first steps in that area. This February, Seattle passed an ordinance that eliminates most uses of fossil fuels in commercial and large multifamily buildings. King County is currently developing a similar policy for unincorporated areas. In April, Tacoma passed a resolution that committed the city to constructing any new municipal buildings without gas, and they set a pathway for citywide electrification as well. And other cities like Bellingham, Olympia, Issaquah, Shoreline, and many more are also looking at instituting policies to phase out gas use. So the impact of this session, including the funding for building electrification investments and beginning that work to clarify the authority for public utilities to offer incentives for fuel switching, those impacts really work hand in hand with this local level work. And this will continue to be our strategy as we continue to move forward on that local work this year and prepare for our next session. Also just wanted to plug that we'll be holding a webinar specifically about how you can get involved in that local work. That webinar will be on June 30th. I'll post a link to register for it in the chat, and it'll also be included in our follow-up email to this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you. And then I want to pass it back to David to talk about the HEAL Act, incorporating environmental justice into the work of state agencies.
Yeah, it was one of the bigger pieces of legislation that passed the year, centering communities of color, was the HEAL Act. And it's been my good fortune to help develop the original, serve as a co-chair of the State Environmental Justice Task Force when I was working with in collaboration with Front and Centered, and then supporting from my new role at the Nation Conservancy, the bill that made it through the finish line. And so the HEAL Act incorporates a number of the Environmental Justice Task Force recommendations, including the definition you see on your screen, which does two things. It's about the meaningful incorporation of perspectives of communities impacted by government actions and facing burdens from toxics and pollutions into the processes that affect them. And that's based off the environmental, the EPA definition that's been in place since the 90s under President Clinton's executive order. But it also builds on that, not just ensuring that we have meaningful participation, but that the outcomes are about distributing equitably to communities as well. So it's a both and, include them in the process, but ensure that the outcome is being, they're maximizing the benefits, minimizing harms to these communities as these kind of policies and ideas move forward. Next slide. And so I think critical that this bill affects about 7 different state agencies. Other agencies can opt in, and starting to hear some agencies being proactive and interested in doing that. And what one of the critical pieces of how agencies can incorporate this perspective into their work and ensure they change how they do things is the use of what we're calling environmental justice analyses. These are a process that's to be developed in conjunction with the Environmental Justice Council and agencies to create guidelines of how an analysis can be conducted. There are a couple components that will be included. You're going to have your quantitative analysis. What does the data show you? What communities are facing on the ground? But critical and related to the definition is, how do we engage communities to understand how they're experiencing impacts and what they are looking for as solutions to the problems they're facing in their communities? And so this kind of work will be triggered in a few different ways, through rulemaking, through policy development, and through the implementation of capital projects. So building projects, capital projects, but also transportation projects. And the focus is on, as it says, maximizing the benefits, minimizing the harms to these communities. All this work will be guided by the Permanent Environmental Justice Council, which will be consisted of a number of community members from across the state representing diverse communities. Also critical, 4 tribal representatives will be on that council as well. And they're working in collaboration with an interagency work group. And my experience is that agencies can too often work in their siloed realms and not do some cross collaboration. And then the experience of working with the Environmental Justice Task Force, the benefit of bringing these folks to the table, comparing notes, finding best practices together, and then combine collaboration with community and agencies, coming up with the best way to implement and move these things forward. So I think that's a very critical piece. And I think these other 2 pieces here about how agencies can embed this work into their culture long-term is embedding environmental justice as a key strategy in their strategic plans, as these 5 to 10-year plans that agencies tend to do to guide their work in the long term. I think this is critical to how embed that into their long work, so it's not seen as an extra after the fact, but critical to the work, centralized in how they move forward. Another thing, a big lesson from our experience in the Environmental Justice Task Force was the concern from communities we heard from across the state. When we could, we traveled across the state, and when we didn't, when we had to go remote, we did specific outreach to communities across the state as well to join our virtual sessions. But the consistent message we heard was concern that government showed up, did things, didn't inform them. This project showed up, policies were passed without informing them. And so one of our key recommendations was community engagement, so that every agency covered by this act will have to develop a community engagement plan for all their for their processes. So when they're developing projects, when they're developing policy, they have community engagement so it informs them, shifts how they actually address the concerns they're hearing and move forward from there. And then the goal of getting equitable distribution of resources, those kind of budget items that are within the discretion of agency, the goal is to reach 40% of investments in these overburdened communities over time. Go.
Awesome. Thank you,
I think
David.
we're handing it.
I think we're handing it back to me for some quick questions. And folks, if you do have questions, we encourage you to post them in the Q&A or in the chat. We're monitoring both. But I have a few that have come in to us. And one thing I'd like to ask is, what are the first changes that people will notice from, we covered a lot of laws today, and Paula mentioned a number of them too that we don't have up on the slides, but we can definitely send out in summary for folks who called in. What do you think are going to be the first changes that people notice from these laws insofar as impacting everyday lives? I know, Paula, you talked a little bit about reduction in air pollution and unemployment benefits and eviction moratorium. But I think just kind of broadly, in particular on climate policy too, when will these changes start to show up and what will they look like?
I'll take that and then go to David and Vlad. I think when you look at the laws, some of these laws became effective in, March and April as soon as the bills were passed. A good measuring stick is 7/25, which is when all of the bills from this session have to be either signed into law or vetoed. And I would say for some of the climate policies, you can feel the impacts right now. And I know that sounds highly optimistic, but you can. We're looking at reports, we're talking to community leaders. We are putting in and implementing right now those pieces that will be starting to be measured in the next 18 months. And so within community groups, we're already going out to all of the legislative districts and talking to folks and saying, who do you think should serve on these EJ councils and these task force, and then working to make sure that those names are put at the top of the list so they really reflect community and not political power or cronyism, right? We're going into groups and talking to all of the different advocacy organizations and explaining what the budgets are and what they do. Understanding that the governor's veto, which we absolutely did not support, deleaked transportation, it also gives us a chance to continue to shape that transportation budget. So we're talking to communities and saying, what are the projects that we can give to Chair Fye and Chair Hobbs that matter to you in your community that you'd like to see in this really robust transportation project? What's important to you? Things like apprenticeships and jobs. You'll start to see that sort of stuff happening right away. With eviction moratorium monies, those monies are moving from OFM and Commerce to organizations like the United Way and the Urban League. Right now, as I'm having this call, we are setting up the legal framework to make sure that you can have right to counsel. Right now, as we're doing this webinar, a lot of the funding that'll go out to your local organizations, either in capital budget or other forms of appropriations, you'll start to see that after Q2, which is June 30th, those funds and those letters have already started to go out to those community groups. So you should start to feel some relief in your community right now. I'd say work with your local organizations. You can certainly contact me. You can contact the Urban League. You can contact NAACP. You can contact Tabor 100 if you don't know where to go for that support. But you will start to see the impact, whether it is an increase in your SNAP benefits, whether it is an increase in what you're seeing in unemployment benefits, or whether or not someone is reaching out to you to make sure that you have housing, or we're starting to talk about air quality monitors in the 37th district or Hilltop. You'll start to feel these impacts sooner rather than later.
And I'd love to just sort of call out in particular Paula touched on this and we talked about this before, but the transportation and transit investments, $5 billion is a substantial step up. I think I mentioned that the last time we had a transportation package, the equivalent amount of money for these purposes was about $1 billion. And when you combine the substantial increase from $1 billion to $5 billion with what David was highlighting with the 40% of that revenue being dedicated to environmental justice communities, so overburdened areas, we're targeting these investments directly to the places where they will have the most benefit, providing increased access and equity, reducing auto reliance. It costs about $9,000 on average to own and operate a vehicle every year, making it possible for people to opt out of that completely unnecessary. Well, it could be a completely unnecessary expense if we commit to a transit and access and mobility access system better than the one we have now. And so really being able to connect our communities to the places where folks want to travel is really important. You know, right now we have in some parts of the state an okay transit system, but even in the best places in Washington, if you're not a 9-to-5 worker, if you work on, you know, a third shift or a second shift, you know, if you don't work the standard kind of Monday to Friday 9-to-5, transit's not a good option for you. If you're not commuting from wherever it is you live to a central business district in a city, transit may not always be a good option for you. And so really expanding our transit system, not just to you know, have more of the same type of service, but service that really meets people and different populations where they are and really fulfills needs that are not the ones we serve now. That's a tremendous opportunity. Washington, like most places in this country, has historically deeply underinvested in transit and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And this is a generational investment in these solutions that will improve air quality, that will obviously tackle climate change, but will also profoundly impact and improve people's quality of life.
Super, thank you. And maybe one last question to close it out. Oh, sorry, we've got a question in the chat too. Will low-income rural areas that may not have air quality issues are they considered overburdened communities?
So Vlad has a bit of an answer there, and I'll just expand on that. I think that the health disparities map has been critical, and a lot of the work that helped develop the HEAL Act, front and center, was critical in helping develop the entire map. And what that does is take a bunch of characteristics to identify communities across the state and the issues they're facing. And, you know, we've had lots of folks look, and I think the common misperception is there's only problems in urban areas. That is just not true. There are air quality problems across the state. Just about every legislative district has some level of air quality concerns. Now, there's a density of concern in urban communities, that is for sure. There are more dense areas that have more problems, and I think but you can find these issues across the state. So these investments, I think, will be targeted across the state in those areas where they're most needed.
Super,
and just maybe expand a little bit on the factors that the map considers. You know, it is air quality, it is environmental exposure, but it's also things like linguistic isolation, you know, high concentrations of households that have language barriers, indicators associated with wealth and employment, and I believe education and health outcome metrics like low birth weight and things like that. So this isn't just looking at places where there's air pollution, right? It's looking at a variety and the confluence of those factors, which, to David's point, there's certainly a concentration and density of those in urban areas, but it's certainly not just an urban phenomenon. And I'm sorry, Paul, I think I stepped on you. So pass it back to you.
Not at all. Look, we're all partners. I love you and David, but no, you're right. There's so much good stuff, Vlad, in this bill. I'm excited that we're going to get to go out in community during this interim and just really sit down with people in their community and explain this in a way that is knowledgeable, concise, and accessible. So you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the fact that there's an equitable distribution of those assets and investments David talked on, it is the largest investment that anyone has ever made in environmental justice. We are just not a leader in our state. We have been leaders in the country. Everyone is looking at what Washington did and said, hey, how did you do it? How did you bring together this really diverse coalition, right? And how can we do it? So Vlad, it's been an honor to be partners with you and David in this work, and I'm looking forward to see what we do next.
Absolutely. We did. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie. Go ahead.
Oh, we've got a few minutes left, and I think Paula's comment really highlights something. You know, we've got folks who have been following our work and Climate Solutions and other groups' work for a long time, and given all of you who have spoken to the depth and breadth of and need for coalition work, and I'd love to hear from maybe each of you, just for activists on the phone, kind of the importance of coalition, what that looks like going forward, and kind of what's next for this work for all of us. I think that would just be great to hear.
I'll jump in there first, and I'll just say this: everybody wins when no one cares who gets the credit. I've been blessed to be able to do this work for a long time, and I know the rub has always been that, you know, Black folks don't have a seat at the table. And I can tell you, as a woman who identifies, for those of you that might be visually impaired, I am African American, brown hair, brown eyes, dark skinned Black woman. I've been at the environmental justice table for 30 years. I can tell you that when this policy started to happen, there was no question from our allies who are white whether or not they would allow us to participate. They asked. And so I think that when we all are willing to give of ourselves and give of our work product without caring who's going to get the credit, humility and humbleness is the ingredients to success.
Very much agree. And I think that's the attitude I think we've all shared and why we've been so able to be so collaborative. And I would also say, like, this is our first step. I think so much of the promises of these legislations can be lost if there's not continued collaboration and cooperation as we move through rulemaking implementation. I think that's where some of the weaknesses of California's program really became evident when that kind of the rulemaking implementation process, we lost some of the promises of that legislation. And so, like, I think we're all, the folks on this call, and I know others as well, are committed to like dogging this legislation, this implementation throughout the process, and we'll need the support of folks on this call to help us continue to build that narrative and support as we move through.
I agree with everything that's been said. The other thing to add is, you know, obviously there's even beyond it, there's more work to do, right? Deepa and I talked briefly earlier about the need to address other emission sectors, the building sector in particular, and, you know, really making choices around if we continue building buildings that rely on fossil fuels that expose, you know, people to health impacts, especially under a cap, we're just exposing people to future impacts. But one of the other things that's really important I want to lift up, Paula mentioned this already, is, you know, not on this call and a core part of the coalition were indigenous communities, tribal nations were absolutely an essential part of this effort. And while there were the bill as well, it will be included in our laws, includes a number of kind of core provisions that I think David described in terms of investment and things like that. To be responsive to the needs of tribal nations. We were, none of us on the call were happy to see the veto of the tribal consultation and consent section, and we're going to follow the lead of tribal nations in hopefully getting that restored next year. We're certainly encouraged by the fact that Governor Inslee has expressed a commitment to doing that, but for us, we supported the bill as it passed the legislature. We thought that an essential component of both the substantive merits of the bill as well as the political formula that got us to where we are, and we're committed to restoring that next year into our law.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Paula, David, Leah, Vlad, Deepa, and the rest of the Climate Solutions team who helped out with put this on today. I appreciate all the folks who called in. We'll be sending out a recording for those of you, for those who missed it, but also if you'd like to rewatch and hear a number of things from our panelists. We'll also put you in contact with them if you have further questions. And we do have some upcoming events. You can check those out on our website at climatesolutions.org/events. There's also a buildings webinar later this month that Deepa mentioned, and I think she posted a link in the chat, but we'll also send that out via email. It's kind of, as Vlad mentioned, a number of things in the beginning stages of tackling building emissions here in Washington State, and that will continue. That work will definitely continue as well throughout the year. Again, thanks so much for joining. We'll see you next time.